This is an absolute treat to welcome Alyssa Kuhns, who's our inaugural School of Interior Architecture Fellow. And just a little bit of background about Alyssa. She has her Bachelor of Architecture from Carnegie Mellon University, her Master of Industrial Design from Pratt Institute, where she also worked at the Danish Institute for Study of Furniture Design. She brings this very unique quality of the intersection of industrialized ideas in terms of the creation of product and architecture, which is a really interesting match for the School of Interior Architecture. And we've really been happy about her being here the past 2 years. Before joining us here, she was a project manager at Massaro Design Build, where she was for about 5 years. And in 2017, she joined us in the School of Interior Architecture. And I've been really quite thrilled to watch her here over the last 2 years. She's had a successful scholarship led to a presentation entitled Domestic Boundaries, Walls and Their Impact on Our Experience of Our Home, where she presented that in London at the Somewhere in Between Borders and Borderlands Conference. And we're just real happy with that production and what you've been doing. Today she's going to be talking about domestic dualities, the multiple context in multiple contexts, and really looking at the exploration of idealized interiors, and often in the form of curated museum experiences as we maybe contrast them against our everyday homes and ways that we live. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alyssa. Thank you.
Can you hear me? It's on. Okay. Thank you very much, David, for that introduction. I want to start by thanking a few people, as usual. First of all, I'd like to thank the Department of Interior Architecture, Liz, Rana, Lisa, Matt, Whitney, Tim, if you're here. There's a small group of us, and obviously David. For even conceiving of a position like this, I think it's really important, especially now in the field of interior architecture, to be defining a research agenda that's appropriate to the field, that's maybe separate from architecture or even interior design as traditionally known. So I think a position like this really helps to do that, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be the first and to be supported by a group like this, and to be able to advance my teaching career and research agenda through this opportunity. I'd also like to thank my students. In the about 20 months I've been here, I taught over 120 students. And most of you are here tonight. Some of you I've had multiple times. So thank you for your patience and for putting up with me as I am learning just like you are, and I think we all can admit to that. As I am new to this field and about 20 months ago, and so it's a process for me just like it is for you. So thank you for that. And then the last people I'd like to thank is my research assistants, Logan Nateston and James Hallowell, here tonight. Thank you for your hard work and your input along the way. It was great to have someone to bounce ideas off of, and for putting up with kind of my crazy thoughts and making them a reality, mostly out in the exhibit. So I appreciate your efforts there. I'd like to start off the presentation by reading a bit, sneak peek, by reading a little bit about my approach to this position in general, the fellowship, and my research in a larger context of the interior architecture field. The idea of dualities, or by definition an instance of opposition or contrast, has consistently played a role throughout my academic and professional career. Working at a design-build firm placed me at the intersection of the design and construction professions. My education in both architecture and industrial design exposed me to opposite ends of the design spectrum in terms of scale, production, and human interaction. Therefore, my approach to this fellowship position was to develop my interest in dualities as a convergence of my experience with architecture and industrial design into yet a third discipline, that of the interior. In Rem Koolhaas's Junk Space, he says, when we think about space, we have only looked at its containers, as if space itself is invisible. All theory for the production of space is based on an obsessive preoccupation with its opposite, substance and objects, i.e. architecture. Therefore, it is the physical objects, or in my view, products, that inform spatial definition. When looking at this photo from Rem Koolhaas's Elements exhibition at the Venice Biennale, which has significantly informed my research, some may see an assembly of products, while others see an interior space or a space between, and others see an architecture. But if we look closely at Rem Koolhaas's Elements of Architecture, the catalog, we see that a majority of architectural elements are singular products available to most through mass production. Therefore, as the field of interior architecture continues to define itself within a larger design discourse, I see value in acknowledging the product in addition to the spatial experience, which is a concept explored throughout this research and the presentation today. So just to set up the presentation and structure it a little, I'm going to start by providing some context to my current research, both through my thesis and larger abstract ideas, and then talk about the methodology of how I produce this research, and then go into the research itself. And honestly, I see this research as a trajectory for future work. So some discussion about possibilities of what I can do next, as I never see this as done. So to begin, backing up, talking about my research at Pratt Institute, which again was my degree in industrial design, I really wanted to focus on the idea of a convergence of products in architecture and how products can start to inform spaces. And I focused on the domestic realm because of the authority that users have over that space and their ability to inform that space on an individual basis. So thinking about the domestic realm and defining space within it, I thought about how we can define those spaces through objects, pieces like furniture, rugs, finishes or fixtures that are inherent to the space. And then obviously there's the architecture. And the most permanent and effective of use of setting these boundaries of space is that of the wall, which was the focus of my thesis. So the wall itself maybe can be considered a product, but it is also an assembly of products. Many of these available at larger home supply stores and available to the masses, not just those within the construction industry. But to back up a little bit about the history of the development of these products that start to inform these boundaries of space, 2018 marked the 100th anniversary of sheetrock. So it has remained unchanged for 100 years. And obviously prior to that we used plaster and lath, which was considered a fine craft. But the advent of sheetrock allowed for more temporary structures and faster construction methods. So in thinking about the terms of the development of the wall, it went from being a fine craft to an industrialized product. And this establishes standards of these products that we accept as the norm. Although a 4x8 sheet of sheetrock, for example, is not the norm throughout the world, it is the norm to us here. So there's still ways that we can start questioning those products and why they are the way they are and how they came to be and develop. As part of my research, I went to the USG plant in actually Bridgeport, Alabama, to see how sheetrock is made and developed, to understand the impact of changing that product as we know it, which would be a major effort based on the standardization that has happened in the industry. So a lot of effort goes into making walls as we know it and the physical boundaries of our space. And a lot of effort goes into plastering, which although we no longer plaster the entire wall, but we still use the craft to make this monolithic form and structure. But also a lot of effort goes into the look of exposing that plaster and exposing that work so that it can be viewed in a perfect manner or laid out by laborers in a very rigid way. But the idea of the wall is in a way being replicated with furniture pieces, and which are more available to the masses and adaptable to spaces. So we think of surfaces in the same way in incorporating storage and these pieces that are more customizable to the individual. And the idea of the wall, even replicating some of the traditional dimensions and proportions of sheetrock as we know it. So to wrap up, some of my thesis work started to question the standards of why we build walls the way we do and how they can incorporate more function or responsiveness to their users. So thinking about transformation and mobility through that structure. And then this was the full-scale final version of it. So being in it within an industrial design program, how we can incorporate products into an architecture. Okay, so I set that up to talk about the larger idea of dualities and how we start to define boundaries within our spaces. So the idea of a duality is that there's an opposing side, and the wall or a physical boundary is one version of that it inherently creates two sides, two differing spaces. But the wall itself has inherent dualities within its form and within its structure. So it is both solid and void. It is a surface and a volume. It is homogeneous and modular. It is permanent, and some consider it temporary. It separates and unites, divides, creates. You can be in and out of it, and it is manufactured, and it is also still a craft by traditional standards. So this is to say that a lot of the dualities that are inherent to the boundaries within our current domestic spaces are physical. They're tangible and perceptible. But this led me to think about my research in a more abstract sense of how domestic spaces start to incorporate boundaries that are cultural, that are maybe cognitive, that are social, and impact our experience of that domestic realm. So one way in which dualities exist in domesticity in general right now is the idea of supply and demand. So there is an increased demand for housing, especially in urban areas, as those populations continue to grow. And construction is rapid. For example, in Long Island City, there's been 28 housing projects that went up in 2016 alone. And by housing project, that means a tower, not just smaller scale projects. So a significant increase in units, yet the cost is still rising for housing. And the idea of the lifestyle or the typologies we live within in these domestic rounds are also beginning to change. So We Live is a branch of We Work. And this was their idea of conceiving of a co-op so that young professionals could have smaller spaces to themselves and share amenities and common spaces to allow for affordability. And they're conceiving this as a new way of living, but really it's just reframing other ways that have been perceived of dormitories and small-scale residences, for example. And the tiny home movement is another example of that, where the idea of personal space is valued so that homes can be affordable to individuals. And there's been other unique typologies, which my students should be familiar with, of reports of married couples living with roommates or elderly people living with college students that can create accessibility in terms of new ways of living and owning your own spaces. So although the lifestyles and living typologies are beginning to change or morph to adapt to these changing domestic conventions, the aesthetic standards are remaining the same and really being pushed through media outlets. So these are derived from cultural standards of what an image is of an interior. And these are just an example, by the way, of magazines I've received at my house over the past about 6 months. I think I have between 30 and 40, and I haven't purchased any products from these companies. So they are prolific in our life of being pushed to have this ideal condition of an interior and establishing a standard that everyone's trying to meet. Even ideas of Pinterest and Facebook pushing life hacks and style advice and showroom-like situations that everyone is trying to achieve. So what this begins to set up is the duality of the idealized interior compared to the realistic way that we use our spaces and live our daily lives. So that is what led me to my current trajectory of research, and I'm now going to go through the method of documentation that I used to develop the work for today. So because I was interested in this idea of ideal versus real, I set out to document both of those conditions. And last summer, I traveled throughout the Northeast and a little into the Midwest to visit both house museums, which represent that ideal condition, and private residences. So the house museum is a duality in and of itself because it is both a residence and a museum, or it was at one time a residence. And that is contrasted with the realistic standards of the private residences. And I found this, I selected the house museums for a variety of reasons, and I'm sure there's many more examples that could come into play. But I really was focused on the interest in a perception of the ideal. So whether that was a community like the Shakers that were considered a utopian society, or iconic architectural pieces that we study in architectural and interior education, the Farnsworth House, Miller House, Gropius House, which are main houses I focused on. Or even I went to the tenement museums in New York because that, although that situation was not ideal in terms of the living unit, it was serving a population that was attempting to achieve an American dream. So that was their goal in being there. And then the private residences, obviously I had to get into the residences, so I used friends and family, so thank you to those people who allowed me into their home and to document it. And I documented places in residences in places I actually have lived. So it was an interesting peek into people's daily lives and people I knew well, and another way to look at their lives. So that led me to an array of photo documentation. So my method into going into these places was to take one-point perspective images of major spaces and tried to do that as consistently as possible so that I could set up a comparison. So this grid is representative of not all, but a majority of the residences I went to, starting on the left with the ideal condition and going into the realistic residences. And is organized by room type so that I could start to draw comparisons between the setup of what is a standard bedroom or living room or kitchen. And the idea behind setting up the one-point perspective was that there was a consistency for comparison and a baseline to be able to compare these incredibly expensive, renowned properties with everyday residences. So starting with thinking about the domestic ideal, I really wanted to focus on, throughout the multiple museums I visited, the Farnsworth House, the Gropius House, and the Miller House. And there was a few reasons for this. First of all, they're obviously all iconic structures that we study within our profession, but they were also all residences that were more or less occupied by a single person throughout time. So in the case of the Farnsworth House, Edith Farnsworth, Gropius lived in his house with his family, and the Miller House was occupied by the Millers. And after their residency, all of these houses became museums, with the temporary exception of the Farnsworth House. So they have lived on longer as museums than they have as private residences. And another reason is we know these structures so well from an exterior perspective, and that is how they've become iconic. And so this is a simple Google search of the Gropius House, and only one interior image comes up. So I really wanted to start thinking about these iconic house museums from the aspect of the interior. And so I set up this logic of conceiving of an iconic view of the interior that I wanted to start dissecting. And this idea came from the work of Rachel Whiteread, which is a big influence on my work. And when she developed her project Ghost, which was a cast of an interior of a room, she realized after stepping back from the project that she became the wall, and that through the casting process, she became the inanimate object of the wall itself and could then therefore see what a wall sees. So I took a similar approach to this, but instead of being a wall, I wanted to model the view as a viewer so that the iconic interior view becomes a solid piece of architecture. So I'll let this play through. So the view that is set up becomes a solid space and is projected from the point of view of the viewer. So the perspective begins to inform the solid shape, and anything behind solid objects that cannot be seen in the view is then subtracted from the form. So it begins to objectify the view and make it a solid piece. And even pieces of furniture, which I considered architecture in this case, become subtracted and the space behind starts to disappear. So what this does is set up a framing of that view and a boundary that is perceptual but also becomes physical and solid. This may take me out of this. So if you've seen my exhibit or plan to stop by afterwards, there are 3 structures, which I'll walk through each of them, that become a solid version of that view cone. And what this begins to tell me is that the space that is occupiable as a solid form can be contrasted with the objects that begin to occupy that space. So going through each project here, starting with the Farnsworth House, I chose this view as the iconic view of the living room. And it has, I'll get into it, but changed significantly over time, and I think that's why it's such an important aspect of the project. So if that view was taken from back into the, I guess, the office space being considered, and it is confined by the core and the glass walls of the exterior. There is an argument that the glass walls begin to expand the interior, but with the landscape of the Farnsworth House that being quite infinite, I decided to crop it at the interior extents. And so with that projection system, you end up with a shape like this that begins to subtract out the core, the fireplace, even the space above that central area, and defining the structure as well. And the reason this view to me is so impactful is because of its drastic change over time. So I myself went to the Farnsworth House as a second-year student, and I had this experience. And about 10 years later, when I took some of you last year, I realized that the space has transformed into this. And the first image is an image of the Farnsworth House with Edith Farnsworth's own furnishings in it. So really what has changed most significantly over this time period is the wardrobe piece. And the wardrobe was rumored to be a point of contention between Farnsworth and Mies van der Rohe, because Mies did not want it in the project, and Farnsworth wanted a space to store her objects. And Mies felt that she didn't need those pieces. So there was a back and forth between this being involved in the project at all, it was a significant spatial definer for the project, it being approximately 6 feet high and 18 feet long. And about 5 years before its conception, George Nelson developed the storage wall, which started to blur the line between what is architecture and what is furniture, which I think you can see a direct correlation of the IKEA pieces we use today. So the Farnsworth house plan, the wardrobe was in some of Mies's original drawings, but because of flood issues, the Farnsworth organization has decided to remove the wardrobe piece and place it in its own building called Farnsworth, which was developed by IIT students as a design build project. So it is no longer in the space. So I decided in a way to analyze the changing time periods of the Farnsworth House and the relationship between the wardrobe and the space, to look at the work of Ellsworth Kelly. This is a piece done in 2002 called Lake 2, and it is a form derived from a viewing of a lake. So that is why you see it in a slight perspective, and it is a shape that is derived from the kind of horizon perspective, similarly to the way I derived the solid forms of this view themselves. So I took that same idea to think about the shape that is formed by the subtraction of the furniture pieces in general, but most particularly the wardrobe. So when Farnsworth lived there, she obviously wanted her own things within the space and had some Danish modern pieces of furniture. Obviously, you can see added bookshelves to the corner because she needed to use the space as a real space. And the wardrobe was oriented 90 degrees to where Mies had placed it, and it aligned with the core. So you can begin to see the greenery that starts to be exposed in between these furniture shapes. Once it became a museum, I believe, it was relocated to turn perpendicularly to the core. And in my opinion, this placement really starts to define the living room as an individualized space instead of a continuation into the outdoors. So you can see that kind of blocked field of vision in the right image. And then as it is today, without the wardrobe piece in general, I think gets to Mies's original idea of the ideal scenario, the very clean, pristine environment. But it is not how Farnsworth used the space herself or how she envisioned using the space. In fact, most of the furniture there was put in the 90s, and some of it being designed by Mies's grandson, not Mies himself. So just a quick comparison between those three views. So moving on to the Gropius House. The Gropius House is unique, I think, because of the time period it was developed, although it's very modern in character. It still represents almost a Victorian idea of very tight, confined spaces. So the view that starts to be developed is that of a singular room compared to the Farnsworth House, which extends beyond the definition of a single room. So you can see the volume that starts to be derived from that iconic view of the living room. The Gropius House begins to approach the real living scenario, I think, best out of these examples, because Gropius lived there himself with his family. So he obviously understood what it took to actually live in a space instead of forcing someone to prescribe to design standards. So you can see that the museum preserves it in a state of being very natural, as if someone had just picked up and left. So there is a collection of objects of Gropius and furnishings, and it's much more of a loose, homey feel. But the thing I found interesting about being there is that idea was pushed to its limits. The idea that someone had just lived there and stepped out. There was fake food in the kitchen on the plates, plastic food. There was clothes hanging, obviously, in the closet, and papers on the desk, even toiletries in the bathroom. So it begins to set up this notion that this is an actual place of residence, as if people who live there were no longer there, but it still preserves it in a very idyllic way, as if the coats, the plates are perfectly placed and curated. Lastly, I want to talk about the Miller House, which is a big inspiration for me, and I think a really great project for students to look at because of the integration of architecture, interior design, and landscape architecture. So this experience visiting this residence was pretty life-changing for me, and I actually ended up going there twice last summer. So the view that is set up is across the conversation pit, which is a well-known piece of the Miller House, looking towards the entry and into the dining space. And you can see this compared to the Gropius House is very open and has a lot of defined spaces within a larger context. So the view that starts to become generated from this process is very large. If you look at the exhibition, just the size of this house compared to the others is very significant. And the view covers a majority of the living spaces and extends very deep into the space. But the view that is being set up as kind of the iconic view is actually not attainable by someone visiting the museum by photography. So this was the closest I could get the first time I went there. There was no photography allowed inside the house, so I could not document that iconic view, but tried my best to take photos outside the house. The second time I went, though, there was an interesting change in that the museum decided to allow photography, but only from one spot in the house. So that would be this rug right here, the photo spot rug, which you could see a majority of the house from that spot, or at least the main living spaces. But as a means to start understanding that, I wanted to develop this axonometric that gave a 360 of that view. So what is the view that is actually obtainable to document and to be captured by visitors today? So you can see it goes to the entry, the living spaces, the conversation pit, and back to the dining room. The other interesting aspect about visiting this house as a museum is the rug system that starts to be the track that visitors can go on. So the Miller House is known for the beautiful rugs designed by Alexander Gerard, custom made for the Miller House, and yet you cannot walk on them because they need to be preserved. And in a lot of cases, you can't even see them in their totality because they're covered by this beige rug system that visitors must follow. The entry being the exception because that is a replication. Oh. So another thing I wanted to document is that rug system because it's such a prescribed way of experiencing and viewing the house, and it's a way that the Millers themselves would never utilize that space or experience in that space. Part of the house on the tour is blocked off completely, and the rest of the tour is brought up to the photo spot and then around the house and back out. And so you can see the impact of that rug system over the existing rugs. So that was a quick summary of how I conceived of the ideal version of these domestic spaces. And there's a lot of relationships that begin to be set up in terms of boundaries and how views are framed and how spatial experience is framed within those settings that differ drastically from the idea of them being actual residences compared to experiencing them as a curated set of experiences. So to go into the domestic realities and looking at how people actually begin to use their space. So I think in the original matrix of images, you can start to see a strong contrast between the way the idealized spaces are established compared to the real spaces. And there's a level of chaos and messiness that begins to happen in the real residences. And there was actually an interesting experiences I had going into these residences and documenting them through photography, and the reception I had from individuals. So while some maybe were indifferent, others were very concerned about their portrayal of their interior, and not necessarily what was happening with these images, but just my presence being there and being overly apologetic for a mess, or making excuses in a way of why their space looked that way and did not meet the traditional standard that is so widely publicized. So I thought about these spaces as being defined by their objects and how they can begin to relate from one space to the next. And while the layout of those spaces obviously start to make connections between the different definitions of the rooms, the objects are set as a placeholder and begin to draw those connections as well. And so this is some of the research that I would like to continue exploring, and I think there's a lot of information within these images that can be teased out. But just thinking about the difference between the house museums and these spaces and the restrictions that don't have to happen in the house museums that are happening here. So even down to the lighting conditions where you don't need privacy and blinds, or you don't need to be able to store things or have children around that allow those house museums to be preserved in such an iconic state and a cleanliness to them. So here's just some examples I pulled out about the laundry basket sitting in the dining room, or even a child's toilet sitting in the dining room. So the one thing I observed from looking at these residences is that the spaces are not necessarily predefined by the room name or the function that begins to happen in that space. So people begin to use that space in a way that is best fit for them and does not necessarily align with what should be considered as part of a dining room or part of a living room. But the function of those spaces begin to morph based on the objects that exist within them. So I completed the series of drawings that start to tease out the objects from those spaces and really highlight the non-architecture of the space. So pulling out everything that is brought to the space by the user and owned by that user. And you can see it takes over a majority of the space in the same way that the casted models begin to subtract space behind those objects in the ideal conditions. Here, the objects subtract out the space of the room. And you can begin to see profiles that are overlaying and creating textures that are inconsistent with the ideal function of that room, whether it's a mess on the table, papers, kids' toys that is intended to be used for a dining space. And then here, thinking about living spaces as well and how they are defined by the objects within them, and questioning whether pieces like air conditioning units, draperies are actually part of the architecture and the interior definition of that space, or are those objects that an individual is bringing to those spaces. So I went very fast here, but I wanted to wrap up by talking a little bit about how this research begins to inform some of my student work, which is ongoing for this semester. Because I think the lessons I'm beginning to learn from looking at these images and dissecting them and analyzing the way people are actually using their spaces is that there's a lot of design opportunity there. So instead of designing spaces that are representative of the pure, clean, beautiful ideal, we can begin to think about the everyday activities that inform our use of space and therefore can be designed in that way. So I tasked my students earlier in the semester to start thinking about domestic behaviors that we do every day that we probably don't think about and that are challenges within our interior space. So Samantha Hale, here tonight, looked at even the action of opening and closing a blind and how that changes our interaction with spatial definition. So whether we're going over obstacles to be able to approach that window, leaning over them, crawling over them, or the use of a window that doesn't have obstacles like that, that is more accessible. And then Julie focused on the idea of changing temperature, so how you can start to adjust your body temperature within a space beyond the idea of a thermostat, beyond the idea of just air pressure, but thinking about location of fans, even using blankets, sleeping bags, even your body positioning within a space, whether you're sticking an arm out from under a cover, starts to create a different relationship between the space and the body and how that moment can maybe be more designed. And then even looking at the way we write and the ergonomics of our body positioning in relationship to the space and the objects we sit on. So thinking about writing position or maybe even reading, laying in a bed, leaning over a table, and how that changes our relationship with our interior space. So I just want to wrap up by saying that I think there's a lot of opportunity right now in the field of interior architecture to incorporate many aspects of products and objects in relationship to the physical confines of space and architectural elements. So understanding the everyday can bring us closer to designing for reality instead of forcing human behavior and tendencies into a prescribed ideal. Thank you very much for your time.
We have some time for some questions.
David.
My, way out here. Did you have a question? Yeah.
So when you were researching the domestic, like the realities for the houses, did you let people know you were coming in advance to kind of, so they wouldn't start to clean up the spaces? How did you keep that bias from happening?
Coming in. Um, I did specifically mention that this was for research purposes and that I wanted to see the real situation. So I did ask them not to clean up, although people did, and I did help. In some scenarios, there was stacking items on the floor. Um, but I really wanted to emphasize that their name would not be attached to this, that it was for really trying to understand how people lived and used their spaces in a way to better that situation and in no way to judge. So I tried to talk through that as best possible, but I think it's a hard fact to face is really allowing people into your home and exposing them to that.
Hi. It's really cool seeing this after having you last year and you talking about you doing the research over the next summer. I was wondering if there was a certain demographic that you were targeting with these homes. Like, were they all families, or were some of them college-age students, or older, younger?
I would love to be able to get a more group to look at a wider variety of homes and typologies. However, I was starting with people I knew. So there were a good amount of architects and designers in that group, which might take away the bias there. And then there was a lot of I grew up with, school members. They were, I would say, relatively within a similar demographic. But I do think there's opportunity. Is that me? I don't know. That. I do think this methodology to think about underprivileged populations and how they can be exposed to design and personal corporate design.
Fascinating. All the way. And I just studied the grid outside of all the photographs and the indexing of all the different rooms.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that from the ideal to real. Were there room types where you saw a lot of flexibility or more, a higher degree of unexpected uses?
Mm-hmm.
Or multiple uses or symbols of one space being used in many different ways.
Yeah, I think, and I can probably dive deeper into this as I continue to look at the photos, but I think the dining room opened itself up to a lot of uses and functions because of the less prescribed function of the furniture that exists there. So the idea of a table was used in a variety of ways versus a kitchen obviously has a very set focus, and a living space with the softer upholstered furniture allows for less flexibility of what's happening on those pieces. So I did find myself drawn to the dining
present. This is so strange. So it seems that in your earlier research and in the current research that you're working on, you're privileging the domestic
Mm-hmm.
over issues about the everyday.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure if I'm correctly, or the everyday and quotidian kind of issues are more important to you. So in the future, would you continue to work in with housing, or maybe looking at things related to the everyday?
So by everyday, we mean more the real versus the unreal. Yeah, I think in developing this presentation and even the exhibit outside, I realized how much of my focus was drawn to no findings. So precedents and difference that I've been for years and wanted to look at from a different aspect. So I think there was less of a prescribed method to analyzing the everyday and the real scenarios that maybe I shied away from because it was it was more unknown. So after this, I would definitely like to push myself to the some of the same Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah.
I know that you majored in architecture and now you currently teach interior. I was wondering if you think that um, architecture is more like idealistic and like more surface area because it is exterior, and then moving into interior, seeing like the reality of it. Like I was wondering your comments and your thoughts about that and how you I guess feel about that, and did that prompt your like research in any way?
On to designing smaller scale spaces. So in a residential project, I was the one designing the unit itself instead of the outer form of the building. So I think that's what drew me to the interior scale, but still from the perspective of an architecture versus a surface level design. I think that intimacy and human interaction can happen at the larger scale of an architecture versus an interior, but it was much more tangible to me to think about the interior space and the one-to-one interaction than the whole. Does that answer your question?
That's broken.
Thank you.
I don't know
Thanks
who's
for your talk and also
Mhm.
for your contribution the last couple of years. It's been great to have you here.
Thanks.
You've got me thinking about plastic fruit, and the relationship between plastic fruit and those magazines that you get that
Mhm.
you haven't bought anything from, and then as an extension, lifestyle.
Mhm.
And that there's perhaps a relationship between plastic fruit and IKEA and domestic life anyway, particularly if it's unfolding around objects.
Mhm.
I mean, did you take the plastic fruit seriously when you saw it?
No, I laughed at it. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I've heard the Farnsworth House described as a terrible house, but it's a great one-story skyscraper.
Mhm.
And I wonder what plastic fruit could be described as,
Yeah.
in terms of the domestic. Like, I have some plastic fruit in my house. I wonder who else
do not. I will say that. Yeah, I think there's a lot of, from these investigations, thinking about the fakery that is involved in all of this. The one, I didn't touch on this, but I did a sketchbook series based on one of those magazines, cutting up images and overlaying the strange objects that are found in there. So in a Crate and Barrel magazine, there was a kiwi sculpture and fish-shaped vases and the kind of imagery that starts to get overlaid in those magazines. And I also went through and counted the people included in those images, and there were no adults included. There was, I think, 4 children included in those images. So just the kind of distance that imagery puts between the actual use and human interaction and the kind of imagery it sets up, I think, is an interesting thought, that none of it's real. Yeah. Lots of.
I'm gonna go right this way.
Yeah.
I guess I had a question about, I guess the 2 words I would use, thank you for your talk. Agency and authority. I guess, like, for example, Gropius has a lot of agency and authority over it. I mean, he designs his own house and
Right.
has control over the interior. Maybe in the Farnsworth case, like, Nees has a lot of authority over the clients, or maybe the Millers have more authority just because of their social position or whatever. And I'm just wondering how you control for differences. Like, you could think of some parents who might not let their children put their easels in the dining room, whereas you can think of others, that's really cool. They're really tolerant of that, so they have a different kind of relationship with, and so there are many people who have authority in that case. There's not like one Gropius in that family. Besides, I'm assuming that their house wasn't designed by them.
Right.
That they're installing themselves into pre-existing space, which is different from Gropius. So I was wondering how you negotiate all those different issues of the authority of the person and the agency of the designer.
Yeah, I think that's a complicated issue for sure. And I think it goes back to, this is what I was able to put together for this summer, but I think it'd be interesting to have a much more descriptive approach to the places that are being documented and understanding the type of people that live there, and the impact they have, like you're saying, authority over their spaces. James, my research assistant, was going through these photos and was kind of guessing the type of person that lived there based on their approach to their spaces, and I think in most cases he was pretty accurate. So I think there's an interesting relationship there between the personality and type of person as they are projected onto their space. So I think going about this process maybe a little differently would be more prescriptive about the type of people that are chosen, or at least to be aware of that.
Just to follow up, partly on what you said and partly on Jason's question, when I was at the Gropius house, the way I felt about the plastic food and the clothing in the closet was that it was an honest attempt to bring in other people besides Gropius into the story, to show her work and her clothing that she made for herself, and then to point out that there was a housekeeper who made the food. In other words, that objects were being used as a way to mark somebody's presence. And I'm just wondering if taking that idea to add to what Greg was saying about authority and agency, but also how we mark our presence, and whose presence is being marked in these more everyday or sort of non-designed spaces that you. In other words, I think that thinking about things as mess might be keeping you from seeing them as actually really important ways that people are celebrating that there's a baby, or that someone got a job, or all sorts of other things, that they aren't mess, that they're a marker of some human presence.
Right. Yeah. No, that's great.
Oh, and thank you. I don't know,
catalog, and all of it is, the whole thing is about how the designers of the catalog want people on the cover and want people on the inside, and then it keeps getting nixed by the boards. Like, this idea about the, like what you're saying is the generic, right, where we put our own selves into those catalogs, and I almost want the catalogs to be a third section of this, because when I'm looking at the grid, I can't tell at this distance what is house museum, what is house, right? And I almost want the catalog, because you've already said you started research on those, already done research,
Yeah.
to be another section where it somehow is starting to be another layer of this blurring, where you take a version of the ideal back into, and maybe you actually start to see some of the furniture from West End show up in somebody's house.
Yeah.
But that documentary, if I can find it, might be on YouTube or something, it's fascinating because it's all about the conversations that you're having about how you then put somebody in a place and how these objects then define not just place but personality. And I think that's the other thing you're getting to. It's not really defining, it's defining space, but it's also defining another kind of sense of place that I think you need another language for. So that
Yeah.
was great.
Yeah, thank you. That was a good point. I did have on my original list to look at retail showrooms as well, which relate probably to the magazine aspect.
Unless you're living in a big city,
Right.
where that's going to have the West Elm, the Crate and Barrel, and all of those things, in Knoxville, where
Yeah.
where do we go, right? So, or you go to the design center or something like that. And
Right.
That yet is another thing because you have to have the designer with you to mediate
Right.
the sales. So I think there's all of these other layers that you can start to get to, that I just think would be kind of interesting.
Yeah.
The other, one more is the showroom, the show house of the condos.
Mhm.
Because they're already fitted out, right?
Right.
Right now you're talking about a time period that's different than this time period. So I think that, like go to Miami for a couple of weeks at the end of the semester. and
Okay.
just tour the condo showrooms because all of them are going to have some place that's already fitted out. See what neat Zaha does, I think, already. And those kinds of things.
Interesting.
Just to kind of see what those things are like.
Right.
Sorry, I'm done.
Great. Thank you very much.
Alyssa, thank you very much. Please take time to go over to the exhibit in 103 and see this amazing collection of drawings and models. And it'd be a nice follow-up from your presentation. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.